On January 6, 1985, my mother survived a massive stroke on the right hemisphere of the brain. The stroke left her with use of the right side of the body, but limited use of her left. I was 16 years old at the time. My parents were still married. However, the stroke was too much for him, and he left home within the next 2 years. Because of Mom's sudden disability, my maternal grandmother extended her stay indefinitely as she became my mother's caregiver. Throughout the years, we maintained a relationship as any mother-daughter would, and life continued. For the next many years, my mother lived independently and in a wheelchair. She had a host of friends and caregivers who would assist her. Her physical health continued to decline. In 2007, after a series of debilitating pneumonia and COPD-related issues, it was time for us to call hospice. Because I was an only child, there was no familial assistance, and it is in these times that people's good intentions are put to the test. Mom was admitted into hospice from the hospital, but hospice sent her home after a few days with nursing and medication support for her at home. I spent almost all my time at her house. She went through many of the stages for preparation of dying that hospice described in their butterfly book. Within a few weeks, she suffered additional strokes, and we returned to hospice. I found it interesting that the hospice room she had both times was the same room that her mother had passed away in several years prior. When she was admitted back into hospice, she could still answer questions and communicate her needs. But by the next morning, I received a call that things had changed. The date was December 23, 2007. She passed away December 26, 2007. Those 3 days changed my life. Mom had a lot of back pain throughout the hospitalizations, but she did not like taking pain medication as it caused her to hallucinate. She had a particularly bad bout while in the hospital because of all the chickens on the outside roof. Of course, there were no chickens. We laughed and laughed. Anyway, Mom was in a catatonic state at this point. She was moaning, and I could tell that her back was hurting her. So I got into bed with her so she could lay on her side and support her back against me. It was the middle of the night. Our blinds were shut, and the room lights were dim. While we were lying there, Mom kept looking and watching a small, weird white light that was on the ceiling. I thought maybe she was hallucinating and seeing something that wasn't there, only I could see it too. The light seemed to come from the corner between the ceiling and the wall. There was nothing in the room or outside of the room that could project onto the wall. The more I stared at the light, the more the light seemed to come down in tandem with Mom's breathing. When she breathed in, the light pushed back. When she breathed out, the light came closer or got brighter. It was very strange. The more I concentrated on the light, the more I began to imagine. And I knew, just knew, this light had something to do with Mom's death. It felt like God's angels coming down a staircase of light. And eventually, I imagined seeing 2 angles on either side of this light, standing like staircase banisters at the end of a long, winding staircase. But I was very tired and emotionally exhausted. It was also Christmas time with my young son at home. My mother was dying. I thought I was hallucinating. The hospice nurse entered the room, and I was embarrassed that I was in the bed with my dying mother, and I jumped out. The experience ended. The next day, another experience occurred, and it was absolutely amazing. I was sitting by my mother's bedside, and all of a sudden she took a big breath and said, "Oh, Amy, it's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." And then she said, "I'm home, I'm home." Her words were the most loving, excited, "I'm home" that I have ever heard in my life. I thought she was seeing her childhood home, so I asked her, "Are you in Wisconsin?" And she nodded, "Yes." I asked, "Are you inside or outside?" She replied, "Outside." I said, "Well, what are you waiting for? There are people waiting for you." In the next instant, she was saying, "Mother, Daddy," and then named some additional relatives. She told me that they were all eating pie, named the pies they were eating, told me there was cheddar cheese on the apple pies, a Wisconsin tradition, and then recited a poem about cheese on pie. I have to back up this story to explain the next part. In hindsight, I have had experiences in my childhood that were also unexplainable. Both occurred at my grandparents' home in Wisconsin. The first was when I was around 4 and 5 years old. I was in the backyard and I saw a Native American hunter, dressed in buckskin hunting clothes and carrying a bow and arrow. I thought he was real and that he would shoot my puppy if he saw us. So I grabbed my puppy and we hid behind the burn barrel until he left. Grandma thought I had an imagination, and that was the end of the conversation. I never forgot seeing him, and always felt as though I might be seeing something that had happened previously. The hunter I saw was not wearing modern clothing. I never mentioned this to my mother. The second event happened the day my grandfather passed away. My mother loved her father dearly, and she was also an only child. The sudden passing of her father was devastating to her, as expected. I was 9 years old at the time. We drove to Wisconsin immediately. That night, I was put to bed in my grandparents' room and on my grandfather's side of the bed. I do not know if I was awake or asleep, but Grandpa was in the doorway with a bright, bright light behind him. He asked me to take care of my mother and grandmother. I told him that I would, and he was gone. I never told my mother because she was so distraught. Returning to 2007, Mom was in a state of reunion of those who love her while also communicating with me. I knew that if I knew for sure she was with her family, then she was really with who she was experiencing, and she will be returned to a fully restored body. So, I asked her, "Mom, when I was little I saw an Indian walking through the woods. Almost instantly she said, 'Yes, one that walks between the worlds.' I was so shocked to receive any sort of answer. I asked the next question, 'Mom, would you please ask Grandpa if I—' And before I could finish asking the question, she said, 'Yes, thank you.' I was floored, shocked, validated, shocked some more. But I knew then and there that she was really, really for real with her family in heaven, and that heaven is real. And that was the last she spoke. The final day was probably the most life-changing day. It was the day after Christmas, and I don't know what time I got to hospice, or how long I was there in the room during the day. I didn't want to leave, because Mom's physical body was close to expiring. But there were errands that needed to happen. I ran to the bank to settle some banking business for her, knowing that it would be easier that day instead of after her death. I went to her home to pick out a dress and some high-heeled shoes, and I went back to hospice and sat next to the bed and didn't move again. I prayed to God all day to take her, prayed for him to pull her out of this broken body. While I was sitting vigil with her, I all of a sudden had an unexplained understanding of how a soul is coaxed out of the body and what those two stairway angels' jobs are. Clearly I was daydreaming again. But as I watched my mother's body shut down, what I was understanding was making perfect sense to me. Eventually her breathing became labored and less frequent or full. My husband was now with me but sitting on the other side of the room, and the hospice nurse was on the other side of Mom's bed. It took not too much time to notice that Mom stopped breathing for several seconds. I looked at the nurse who checked her vitals and confirmed that her heart was still beating. This continued for a few more breaths. When my mother exhaled her second to the last breath, I was very physically close to her. I was rubbing her face, trying to match her breaths as she was struggling with that death rattle. I thought if she could hear and or feel my breathing, somehow it would make it easier for her. A minute later, she breathed out, and when she did, I breathed in. Immediately, it felt like my insides were filled with dry ice. It was a significant, physical, and breathtaking event where time stopped. Everything stopped. I don't know how long it stopped for, but it was a significant enough amount of time to have both the nurse and my husband reach me, and both were standing next to me when I was able to exhale the breath. That was not a breath or anything else I could understand. Finally, I exhaled, and Mom took one more body breath. However, I knew immediately that she was leaving this earth when that cold went through me. I call it her soul breath. For several hours after Mom passed, I was unable to respond appropriately to her death. I had so much joy and relief for her to be out of that broken body, I could not be sad. I'm sure the other hospice families questioned my emotions. Since December 26, 2007, I have been seeking answers as to what happened to me. I have searched high and low. I think I have immersed myself in every type of spiritual activity to try to find answers to these events. Never in a million years would I have thought that I had experienced a shared death experience. I had heard about others who have witnessed souls departing the body, or have had magical messages, or claim to be mediums. But none of those groups, ideologies, theories, practices, intents, or spiritual practices felt like or could answer what I experienced that day. No one, not one ever could identify any reason, except for my friends who reminded me that God had delivered a blessing. It was a gift. That does it for today's video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment below.